All names, places, and institutions are aliases used to protect privacy. Procedures and timelines reflect real-world law and forensics for immersion. The holding cell beneath Granite County Superior Court smelled of disinfectant and decades of waiting. Rook sat on the steel bench, hands folded, watching the second hand on the wall clock crawl toward 3 in the afternoon. 22 years had taught him patience, the kind that accumulates in places where time moves differently, where calendars mark not progress but endurance. But today, the minutes felt heavier, each tick a small battle between hope and the instinct to protect himself from hope. Upstairs, in Judge Keystone's courtroom, his attorney was arguing a motion to vacate, a legal mechanism that sounded clinical, almost sterile, until you understood what it meant. The chance to walk out of a building you entered as a young man and leave as someone the calendar had aged but never freed. The motion rested on a single piece of evidence, a latent fingerprint lifted from the driver's side door handle of the victim's car, photographed and catalogued in 2003, then buried in an evidence locker for 2 decades. The print had been excluded at trial, deemed insufficient for comparison by the standards of the time, filed away as inconclusive, a fragment of data that didn't fit the narrative prosecutors had constructed. But forensic science had moved forward while Rook served his sentence. Automated fingerprint identification systems had grown exponentially more precise, capable of mapping minutiae points, ridge endings, bifurcations, dots, and enclosures that older manual comparisons missed or dismissed as ambiguous. 3 months ago, a post-conviction DNA clinic affiliated with a university law school had filed a motion under the state's newly amended statute allowing re-examination of physical evidence with advanced methods. The clinic had requested access to the original evidence, and the fingerprint card had been digitized, scanned at high resolution, and uploaded to the National Automated Fingerprint Identification System. It had returned a match, not to Rook, but to someone else entirely. That mismatch was the crack in the wall, the fracture that spread through the foundation of the conviction. It contradicted the prosecution's core narrative, that Rook had been alone with the victim, that he had driven her car from the scene, that no other plausible suspect existed, that the physical evidence and witness testimony converged on a single, inescapable conclusion. The defense had always argued the print was exculpatory, that it belonged to the real perpetrator, that the state's refusal to pursue it was a failure of due process. The state had countered that it was inconclusive, possibly transferred, irrelevant in the face of eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Now, with a name attached to the whirls and ridges, with a criminal history and a geographic link to the crime scene, the argument had shifted from theory to fact. Rook heard footsteps in the corridor, the jangle of keys, the low murmur of the bailiff speaking into a radio. The door opened. "They're ready for you," the bailiff said. "If you're drawn to stories where the truth hides in plain sight for years, waiting for someone to look again, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. These cases matter because they show how fragile certainty can be, how easily evidence is overlooked, and how much courage it takes to challenge a verdict the system has already pronounced." The crime had occurred on a humid evening in late August in the industrial outskirts of Riverbend, a mid-sized city bisected by freight rail lines and old textile mills that had shuttered in waves over the preceding decade. The victim, whom we'll call Iris, was a shift supervisor at a packaging plant on the eastern edge of the city, where she managed a crew of 12 workers assembling cardboard boxes for a regional distributor. She had worked the evening shift that day, 3 to 11:30, and had left the plant on schedule, waving to a co-worker as she walked across the gravel employee lot toward her sedan parked in the northwest corner. Security footage from a camera mounted above the loading dock showed her unlocking the door, getting in, and pulling out onto the access road. The camera's angle captured the taillights disappearing toward the highway, the timestamp reading 11:34 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of Iris alive. At 6:10 the next morning, a jogger running a route through a wooded area adjacent to an abandoned rail yard found Iris's body lying face up in the underbrush, partially concealed by fallen branches. She had been strangled. The medical examiner would later determine that the cause of death was ligature strangulation, with petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and bruising consistent with a cord or narrow strap. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or forearms, suggesting the attack had been sudden or that she had been incapacitated quickly. Her purse was missing. Her car was discovered 2 hours later, parked behind a shuttered warehouse 3 blocks from the rail yard, the engine cold. The keys were on the floorboard beneath the driver's seat. A brown leather wallet, emptied of cash, but still containing credit cards and a driver's license, lay on the passenger seat. The driver's side door was ajar, the interior dome light drained by hours of exposure. Crime scene technicians from the Granite County Sheriff's Office arrived at both locations, the body dump site and the vehicle recovery site, and began processing evidence. At the rail yard, they photographed tire impressions in the dirt near where the body had been found, collected soil samples, and marked the position of the victim. At the warehouse, they photographed the car from multiple angles, dusted the exterior door handles and interior surfaces for fingerprints, swabbed the steering wheel and gear shift for DNA, and documented the position of the keys and wallet. They lifted 3 partial impressions from the driver's side door handle, one clear enough to photograph and preserve on an acetate card, the other 2 too smudged or incomplete for analysis. The clear print was catalogued as Evidence Item 47B, photographed under forensic lighting and stored in the evidence archive. The investigation moved quickly, driven by public pressure and the urgency that accompanies violent crimes in smaller communities. Detectives, led by a veteran investigator we'll call Harbour, canvassed the neighborhood around the warehouse, knocking on doors, interviewing residents, and reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses. Most of the cameras in the area were non-functional or pointed away from the alley where the car had been found, but Harbour's team compiled a timeline based on witness statements and traffic patterns. A witness, whom we'll call Moss, came forward 2 days after the body was discovered. Moss lived in a second-floor apartment with a narrow window overlooking the alley behind the warehouse. He told detectives he had been awake late that night, unable to sleep, and had looked out the window around 2 in the morning. He said he had seen a man matching Rook's general description: height, build, clothing, walking away from the area where the car was later found. Moss's statement was vague on specifics. He hadn't seen the man's face clearly, only a silhouette under a street lamp at the end of the alley. But he mentioned a denim jacket and work boots, items that detectives knew Rook commonly wore. Rook had been questioned early in the investigation because he worked night security at a warehouse complex half a mile from the rail yard. The complex consisted of 4 large buildings used for storage and light manufacturing, and Rook's job was to patrol the grounds, check locks, and monitor the loading docks for signs of intrusion or theft. He had clocked in at midnight on the night of the murder and clocked out at 7 the next morning, a time frame that overlapped with the estimated time of death, which the medical examiner placed between midnight and 4 a.m. based on body temperature and rigor mortis. Rook's time card showed no gaps, but the warehouse was poorly monitored. Cameras covered the loading docks and main entrances, not the interior offices where guards spent downtime between patrols. His supervisor, whom we'll call Pine, acknowledged during an interview that guards routinely stepped out for breaks, smoked cigarettes in the parking lot, or drove short loops around the perimeter without logging those movements. That ambiguity became a problem when Moss's identification entered the equation. Harbour brought Rook in for a second interview 3 days after Moss came forward. The session was conducted in a windowless interrogation room at the Granite County Sheriff's Office, a space furnished with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a wall-mounted camera that was not recording. Policy at the time did not mandate recording of interviews unless the suspect explicitly requested it, and Rook had not made such a request. According to the police report filed by Harbour, the interview lasted 6 hours, beginning at 9 in the morning and continuing with brief breaks until mid-afternoon. Rook initially denied knowing Iris. When confronted with cell tower data showing his phone had pinged a tower near the rail yard around 2:15 a.m., he acknowledged having driven past the area during a routine patrol, but insisted he had seen nothing unusual. No parked car, no person, no activity. Harbour pressed harder, suggesting that Rook had encountered Iris after her shift, perhaps offering help with a flat tire or mechanical trouble, and that something had gone wrong. An argument, a miscommunication, an escalation. Rook maintained his innocence. He did not confess. No written statement was obtained, but Harbour's report described Rook as evasive and uncooperative, language that would later appear in the prosecutor's opening statement at trial. The forensic evidence collected from the car and the body was thin, a fact that would become a point of contention throughout the case. DNA collected from the steering wheel using a cotton swab produced a partial profile consistent with Iris, but no secondary contributor could be definitively identified. The sample was degraded, likely due to environmental exposure or the victim's own contact overwhelming other traces. The fingerprint from the door handle, evidence item 47B, was catalogued but not matched. At the time, the state's fingerprint database relied on manual comparison by certified latent print examiners, a labor-intensive process requiring a known suspect's prints for side-by-side analysis. Rook's prints were on file. He had been fingerprinted as part of the background check required for his security job, but the examiner assigned to the case, whom we'll call Flint, concluded after reviewing the latent print that it lacked sufficient clarity for a definitive match or exclusion. The report, filed 2 weeks before trial, stated insufficient minutiae for individualization. Latent print exhibits 7 identifiable ridge characteristics. Minimum threshold for positive identification is 12 points of concordance. Cannot confirm or eliminate subject as source. The case went to trial 14 months after Iris's death. The prosecutor, whom we'll call Slate, was a senior attorney in the Granite County District Attorney's Office with a reputation for methodical case construction and persuasive closing arguments. Slate built the narrative around 3 pillars: Moss's eyewitness identification, the cell tower ping, placing Rook's phone near the rail yard at a time consistent with the crime, and Rook's alleged evasiveness during the interrogation. Slate argued that Rook had encountered Iris shortly after she left work, that he had forced her into her car under some pretext, driven to the rail yard, committed the murder, then abandoned the vehicle, and walked back to his patrol route to establish an alibi. The motive, Slate suggested, was robbery. Iris had been carrying approximately $200 in cash from a second job she worked off the books cleaning offices on weekends. The cash was never recovered. The defense, led by a public defender we'll call North, challenged each pillar in pre-trial motions and at trial. North argued that Moss's identification was unreliable, made under poor lighting conditions, at a distance of approximately 40 yards, with no clear view of facial features, and compromised by suggestive identification procedures. North filed a motion to suppress the identification, citing case law on the dangers of eyewitness testimony and the need for careful procedural safeguards. The motion included an affidavit from an expert in human memory and perception, whom we'll call Sage, who explained that cross-racial identifications, Moss was white, Rook was black, carried heightened risk of error, that stress and darkness further degraded accuracy, and that post-event information could contaminate a witness's recollection. Judge Keystone, presiding over the trial, denied the motion, ruling that the identification's reliability was a question for the jury to weigh, not for the court to exclude. The cell tower evidence was similarly contested. North called a telecommunications expert, whom we'll call Vale, who testified that cell tower pings indicated only the general area where a phone was located, not a precise GPS coordinate. Vale explained that the tower Rook's phone had pinged covered a radius of approximately 2 miles, including not only the rail yard, but also the warehouse complex where Rook worked and the residential neighborhoods in between. Vale testified that a phone could ping a particular tower for reasons unrelated to the user's precise location: signal strength, network load balancing, topography. On cross-examination, Slate elicited that the ping was consistent with Rook being near the rail yard, even if it didn't prove he was there. The jury heard both interpretations. The interrogation notes became a flashpoint. Harbour testified about the 6-hour interview, describing Rook's demeanor as defensive and his answers as inconsistent. North objected repeatedly, arguing that without a recording, the jury was hearing Harbour's interpretation rather than Rook's actual words. North moved to exclude Harbour's characterizations as hearsay and opinion. Judge Keystone allowed Harbour to describe what Rook had said, but instructed the jury to consider the absence of a recording when evaluating the testimony. Rook took the stand in his own defense, a risky decision that North had counseled against but ultimately supported. Rook testified that he had answered all of Harbour's questions truthfully, that he had not been evasive, that he had been confused and frightened by the accusation. He described his patrol route that night in detail, acknowledging that he had driven past the rail yard, but insisting he had seen nothing unusual. On cross-examination, Slate hammered at the gaps in Rook's timeline, the lack of corroboration, the cell tower ping. The exchange was tense, with Rook's answers growing shorter and more defensive under the pressure. The fingerprint became a focal point of pre-trial motions and trial testimony. North filed a motion to compel the state to release all forensic reports, including Flint's inconclusive analysis of the latent print from the door handle. Slate disclosed the report in discovery, but argued in a pre-trial hearing that the print was irrelevant. It could have been left by anyone who had touched the door handle in the days or weeks before the crime. Perhaps a mechanic who had serviced the car, a valet at a restaurant, a stranger who had leaned on the vehicle in a parking lot. North countered that the print was exculpatory, that it suggested another person had come into contact with the car around the time of the crime, and that the state's failure to pursue the print's source was a failure of due diligence. Judge Keystone ruled the print admissible, but noted in the order that its probative value was limited, given the inconclusive nature of the comparison. At trial, North called Flint to the stand and asked him to explain his analysis. Flint described the process of comparing latent prints to known exemplars, the threshold for individualization, the challenges posed by partial or degraded prints. He confirmed that the latent print from evidence item 47B exhibited only 7 identifiable ridge characteristics, below the 12-point standard used by most agencies for positive identification. North asked whether the print could have belonged to someone other than Rook. Flint confirmed it could. North then asked whether the print might belong to the actual perpetrator, someone who had touched the door handle while moving the victim's car. Slate objected. Speculation, lack of foundation. The objection was sustained. North rephrased. Could the print belong to an unknown third party who had contact with the car? Flint said yes, it was possible. Slate on redirect asked Flint whether it was also possible the print had been left innocently, days before the crime. Flint agreed. The testimony ended in ambiguity, leaving the jury to decide what weight, if any, to assign to the unidentified print. The jury heard from Moss, who testified with apparent confidence despite the weaknesses in his identification. He described seeing a man in denim walking away from the alley around 2 a.m., his gait unhurried, his hands in his pockets. Under cross-examination, North pressed him on the distance, the lighting, the duration of the observation. Moss admitted it had been brief, perhaps 10 or 15 seconds. North introduced evidence of the photo array Harbour had shown Moss 2 weeks after the crime, a 6-photo spread that included Rook's booking photo taken after his arrest, in which he appeared haggard and dishevelled, while the other photos were driver's license images in which the subjects appeared composed. North argued this created a suggestive bias, steering Moss toward Rook. Slate countered that Moss's identification was corroborated by the cell tower data and Rook's proximity to the scene, and that suggestiveness alone did not render an identification invalid if the witness had an independent basis for recognition. The jury was instructed to weigh Moss's credibility and the reliability of his identification as part of their deliberations. The verdict came back after 8 hours of deliberation. Guilty of second-degree murder. Judge Keystone scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, Slate argued for the maximum term, citing the brutality of the crime and the vulnerability of the victim. North argued for leniency, noting Rook's lack of prior criminal history and the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Iris's family, represented by her sister, whom we'll call Lark, delivered a victim impact statement describing the loss, the grief, the absence that could never be filled. Judge Keystone sentenced Rook to 25 years to life, noting that while the evidence was largely circumstantial, the jury's verdict reflected their assessment of credibility and the totality of the proof. North filed a direct appeal, challenging the admission of Moss's identification, the exclusion of certain defense evidence, and the sufficiency of the evidence to support the verdict. The appellate court affirmed the conviction in a brief opinion, citing the totality of circumstances supporting the jury's verdict and the trial court's discretion in evidentiary rulings. The fingerprint was mentioned in a footnote. Defendants claim that an unidentified print exonerates him is unpersuasive, absent evidence linking the print to another individual. The print's inconclusiveness cuts both ways and does not undermine the verdict. Rook was transferred to a state correctional facility in the northern part of the state, a sprawling complex of low-slung concrete buildings surrounded by double fencing topped with razor wire. The facility housed approximately 2,000 inmates, divided into units by security classification and behavioral history. Rook was assigned to a medium security unit, sharing a cell with another inmate serving time for armed robbery. He adapted to the rhythms of incarceration, the 6 a.m. count when guards walked the tiers shouting numbers, the cafeteria lines where trays were filled with portions that never quite satisfied, the narrow cot with a thin mattress that left his back aching, the constant noise that made true silence impossible. He worked in the prison library, a quiet job that allowed him access to legal texts and a typewriter he used to draft motions and correspond with North, who had continued to represent him pro bono on post-conviction matters. The first post-conviction motion, filed 3 years into his sentence, argued ineffective assistance of counsel at trial, claiming that North should have called additional alibi witnesses and challenged the cell tower evidence more aggressively. The motion was denied after a hearing in which Judge Keystone found that North's performance had met the standard of reasonableness and that the outcome would not have been different with different tactical choices. The second motion, filed 5 years later, sought access to the victim's full autopsy file, theorizing that forensic details, time of death estimates, trace evidence, might support an alternative suspect theory or undermine the prosecution's timeline. That motion was also denied, with the court ruling that the autopsy had been disclosed in discovery and that speculation about alternative interpretations did not constitute newly discovered evidence. The years accumulated in increments. Parole hearings every 2 years, each ending in denial because Rook maintained his innocence and refused to express remorse for a crime he insisted he had not committed. The parole board's standard position was that acceptance of responsibility was a prerequisite for release, and Rook's refusal was noted in every denial. His mother, whom we'll call Ember, attended the first 5 parole hearings, sitting in the small room with its institutional furniture and fluorescent lighting, listening as Rook answered questions and the board delivered its decision. Then her health declined. Diabetes, then a stroke that left her partially paralyzed, and the visits stopped. His sister, whom we'll call Wren, maintained contact through letters and occasional visits, but the distance and the strain of seeing her brother behind glass took a toll. Rook's daughter, born a year before his arrest, grew up knowing him only through supervised visits in a prison visiting room. Conversations mediated by the awareness that a guard was always watching, that time was limited, that normal father-daughter experiences, birthday parties, school events, everyday routines were impossible. The emotional toll was fractal, affecting every dimension of life. Rook missed his daughter's first day of school, her graduation from middle school, her driver's license test. He missed Ember's final months, learning of her death through a phone call from Wren and attending the funeral in shackles, escorted by 2 guards who stood at the back of the chapel. He missed the small, unremarkable moments that constitute a life. Dinners at the kitchen table, walks in the park, conversations that meander without agenda. He watched other inmates receive visits, letters, packages, while his own support network shrank year by year as people moved on, relationships faded, and the man he had been became harder to remember. The breakthrough came not from a legal strategy, but from a change in statutory law. In the 18th year of Rook's incarceration, the state legislature passed an amendment to the Post-Conviction Relief Statute, expanding the grounds for re-examining physical evidence. The amendment was the result of advocacy by innocence organizations and exonerees who had testified about the barriers to post-conviction DNA testing and the number of cases where evidence existed but could not be accessed under existing law. The new statute allowed defendants to petition for advanced forensic testing, including fingerprint reanalysis, using automated systems, DNA testing using probabilistic genotyping, and other methods unavailable or undeveloped at the time of trial. If 3 conditions were met, the original evidence had been preserved, the testing method was scientifically valid, and the results could reasonably support a claim of actual innocence. The law was prospective, meaning it applied to all cases, regardless of when the conviction occurred, as long as the evidence still existed and the statutory criteria were satisfied. A law professor at a university 200 miles south, whom we'll call Thorne, ran a post-conviction innocence clinic with a small team of law students and volunteer attorneys. Thorne had spent 15 years reviewing cases, filing motions, and representing inmates in evidentiary hearings, securing exonerations in 7 cases involving DNA evidence, false confessions, and prosecutorial misconduct. The clinic operated on a shoestring budget, funded by grants and donations, and received hundreds of applications each year from inmates claiming wrongful conviction. Thorne's screening process was rigorous. Students reviewed trial transcripts, forensic reports, and appellate decisions, looking for cases where new evidence or testing might make a difference. Rook's case arrived in a manila envelope, forwarded by North, who had reached out to Thorne after reading about the clinic's work in a legal journal. The application included trial transcripts, Flint's inconclusive fingerprint report, Harbour's interrogation notes, and a handwritten letter from Rook, outlining the facts and explaining why he believed the fingerprint was the key to proving his innocence. Thorne assigned the case to a second-year law student, whom we'll call Cress, and a forensic consultant, whom we'll call Juniper, who specialized in latent print analysis and had testified as an expert in federal and state courts. Cress and Juniper spent 3 months reviewing the materials, cross-referencing Flint's report with modern fingerprint identification standards, and researching case law on post-conviction testing. Juniper's initial review focused on the original evidence photos of the latent print from the door handle. The print had been photographed in high resolution by 2003 standards, but the image quality was grainy compared to modern digital captures, and the contrast between the ridge detail and the background was uneven, making manual comparison difficult. Juniper requested the physical evidence card, the acetate lift containing the actual print, from the Granite County Evidence Archive, submitting a formal motion for access under the new statute. The archive, a climate-controlled facility in the basement of the sheriff's office, had preserved the card in a sealed envelope, labeled with the case number and evidence item designation. The clerk who retrieved it noted that the envelope had not been opened since it was filed in 2003, a fact documented in the chain of custody log. Juniper examined the lift under a forensic light source, adjusting the wavelength to enhance ridge detail, then scanned it using a high-resolution digital scanner capable of capturing detail at 600 dots per inch, far exceeding the capability of the original photography. The scan revealed ridge characteristics that had been obscured or ambiguous in the earlier images, additional bifurcations, a clear ridge ending, and a distinctive loop pattern. Juniper counted 14 identifiable minutiae points, well above the threshold Flint had reported. The scan was uploaded to the state's automated fingerprint identification system, known as AFIS, a database that had grown from several 100,000 records in 2003 to over 12 million by the time of the search. The system used algorithms to compare the minutiae points of the latent print against known exemplars, scoring each comparison and ranking potential matches by probability. The search parameters were set to return the top 20 matches for manual verification. The system processed the query and returned results after 48 hours. The top match, with a confidence score of 96%, belonged to a man we'll call Thorne, who had been arrested 5 years after Iris's murder on charges of auto theft and burglary, and whose fingerprints had been entered into the database at that time. Juniper cross-checked the match manually, printing high-resolution images of the latent print and Thorne's known exemplar and placing them side by side. She verified 12 concordant minutiae points, ridge endings, bifurcations, and spatial relationships between features, using the ACV methodology standard in forensic science: analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification. The match was definitive, meeting the threshold for individualization. Juniper prepared a detailed report documenting the comparison, including annotated images marking each concordant point, a narrative explanation of the methodology, and a conclusion stating that the latent print from evidence item 47B had been made by Thorne to the exclusion of all other individuals. The report noted that the print's clarity and the number of matching points exceeded the standards for courtroom testimony, and that the match's statistical probability was in excess of 1 in 10 billion. Cress researched Thorne's background, pulling arrest records, court filings, and geographic data. Thorne's criminal history included convictions for auto theft, burglary, and receiving stolen property. At the time of Iris's death, he had been living in Riverbend, less than 2 miles from the rail yard where her body had been found. Court records showed he had been on probation for a prior offense and had failed to report to his probation officer in the weeks following the murder, a violation that had resulted in a warrant for his arrest. Cress drafted a motion to vacate Rook's conviction under the newly amended statute, attaching Juniper's forensic report, the AFIS match documentation, Thorne's criminal history, and a supplemental legal memorandum arguing that the fingerprint constituted newly discovered evidence that was material and exculpatory. The motion argued that the fingerprint was exculpatory because it placed Thorne in direct contact with the victim's car around the time of the crime, contradicting the prosecution's theory that Rook had been the sole individual with access to the vehicle. The motion also raised a Brady claim, arguing that the state's failure to pursue the fingerprint source at trial, despite the defense's repeated requests and Flint's acknowledgement that the print could belong to an unknown third party, constituted a violation of the prosecution's duty to disclose material exculpatory evidence. The motion requested an evidentiary hearing to present the fingerprint evidence and to allow the court to assess its impact on the verdict. The Granite County District Attorney's Office, now led by a new elected DA, assigned a senior prosecutor, whom we'll call Ridge, to respond to the motion. Ridge reviewed the file, consulted with Slate, who was no longer with the office but provided informal input, and filed a response opposing the motion. The DA's response acknowledged that the fingerprint matched Thorne, but argued that the match did not prove Rook's innocence or undermine the conviction. Ridge argued that the print could have been transferred innocently. Thorne might have touched the door handle days or weeks before the crime, perhaps during an encounter with Iris at a gas station, a parking lot, or another public place, or while attempting to break into the car on a prior occasion. Ridge noted that fingerprints can persist on surfaces for extended periods, especially if the surface is protected from weather and handling, and that the presence of Thorne's print did not exclude the possibility that Rook had also been in the car or had committed the crime without leaving identifiable prints. The response also argued that Thorne had never been charged or investigated in connection with Iris's death, that no other evidence linked him to the crime scene or the victim, and that the motion was speculative. Ridge requested that the motion be denied or, in the alternative, that any evidentiary hearing be limited in scope. Judge Keystone, still presiding after more than 2 decades on the bench, reviewed the filings and scheduled an evidentiary hearing for 6 weeks later. The hearing would be conducted as a bench proceeding, with the judge acting as fact-finder, evaluating the credibility of witnesses and the weight of the evidence. The courtroom was reserved for a full day, with witness lists submitted by both sides. Thorne's team planned to call Juniper to explain the fingerprint comparison quarry, a retired detective who had reviewed the original investigation file at Thorne's request, to testify about investigative deficiencies, and, if willing, Thorne himself to address the fingerprint and his potential connection to the crime. Ridge planned to call Flint to defend the original analysis and to cross-examine Thorne's witnesses on the limitations of the fingerprint evidence. The hearing took place on a cold morning in mid-February. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting the courthouse steps and the surrounding streets. The courtroom was half full. Reporters from the local newspaper and a regional news station, a handful of advocates from Thorne's clinic, students who had worked on the case, and Wren, sitting in the front row behind the defense table. Rook was brought in from the county jail, where he had been transferred 2 days earlier for the hearing, wearing an orange jumpsuit with Granite County Jail stenciled on the back. His hair was grey at the temples, his face lined in ways it hadn't been at trial, his posture slightly stooped from years of institutional life. Thorne sat at the defense table, flanked by Kress and North, who had flown in to observe. Ridge sat at the prosecution table with a junior assistant, surrounded by binders and exhibits. Juniper testified first, sworn in, and seated in the witness box. Thorne walked her through her credentials: bachelor's degree in forensic science, master's degree in criminal justice, 15 years as a latent print examiner, certification by the International Association for Identification, testimony in over 80 trials. Judge Keystone qualified her as an expert. Thorne then asked Juniper to explain the fingerprint comparison process, and she walked the court through the methodology step by step: the initial scan of the acetate lift, the enhancement of ridge detail using digital filters, the upload to A5S, the return of the match, and the manual verification. She displayed side-by-side images of the latent print and Thorne's known exemplar on a projector screen mounted on the courtroom wall, using a laser pointer to indicate the 12 concordant minutiae points. Here, a ridge ending; there, a bifurcation; here, a distinctive loop. She explained that the match exceeded the standards for individualization, that the probability of the print belonging to anyone other than Thorne was vanishingly small, and that the print's clarity suggested it had been deposited relatively recently before being photographed. Under cross-examination, Ridge pressed Juniper on the transfer theory. Could the print have been deposited before the crime? Juniper acknowledged it was theoretically possible, but noted that latent prints degrade over time, especially on outdoor surfaces exposed to weather, humidity, and handling. She testified that the print's clarity, its crisp ridge detail, and lack of smudging suggested it was relatively fresh at the time it was lifted. Ridge asked what relatively fresh meant in terms of hours or days. Juniper said the degradation rate depended on environmental conditions, but in her experience, a print of this quality on an exterior door handle, exposed to the elements, would likely have been deposited within a day or two of being photographed, possibly within hours. Ridge asked whether she could rule out a longer time frame with absolute certainty. Juniper said she could not, but that the weight of the evidence favored a recent deposit. Ridge nodded, suggesting to the judge that the ambiguity undermined the print's exculpatory value. Thorne called Quarry, the retired detective, as the second witness. Quarry had spent 30 years in law enforcement, including 15 as a homicide investigator in a neighboring county, and had reviewed the Rook case file at Thorne's request. Quarry testified that Harbour's case notes contained references to other potential suspects and investigative leads that had not been pursued after Moss's identification focused the investigation on Rook. Quarry pointed to a note in Harbour's file referencing a tip from an anonymous caller who had reported seeing a man matching a different description: taller, thinner, with a tattoo on his forearm, near the rail yard the night of the murder. The tip had been logged, but not followed up. Quarry also noted that Thorne's name did not appear anywhere in the investigative file, despite his criminal history, his proximity to the crime scene, and the fact that he had been on probation at the time and had violated that probation shortly after the murder. Quarry testified that in his experience, an unidentified fingerprint on the victim's car would typically trigger a database search and follow-up investigation, and that the failure to do so here was a significant oversight. Ridge objected, arguing that Quarry's testimony was speculative, that investigative decisions made 22 years earlier should be evaluated in context, and that Monday morning quarterbacking was not grounds for vacating a conviction. Judge Keystone overruled the objection, noting that the hearing's purpose was to assess whether newly discovered evidence would have affected the outcome, and that investigative context was relevant to that assessment. Ridge cross-examined Quarry, asking whether he had been present during the original investigation, whether he had access to all the information Harbour had at the time, and whether he could say definitively that the outcome would have been different if Thorne had been identified earlier. Quarry conceded he had not been present, that his review was based on documents, and that he could not guarantee a different outcome. But he maintained that the fingerprint was significant, and that its omission from the trial was prejudicial to the defense. Thorne's final witness was Thorne himself, subpoenaed from the county jail, where he was serving a 6-month sentence for a probation violation on an unrelated case. Thorne was escorted into the courtroom by a bailiff, his wrists cuffed, his demeanor wary. His public defender, appointed to advise him during the hearing, sat beside him and whispered briefly before Thorne took the stand. Judge Keystone instructed Thorne that he had the right to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and that any statements he made could be used against him in future proceedings. Thorne acknowledged the warning. Thorne began with a direct question. Had Thorne known Iris? Thorne paused, glanced at his attorney, then answered, yes. Thorne asked how they had met. Thorne said they had encountered each other at a bar in Riverbend a few weeks before her death, that they had talked briefly, that he had seen her in the parking lot afterward and had helped her when her car wouldn't start. Thorne asked what kind of help. Thorne said her battery had been dead and he had given her a jump start using cables from his truck. Thorne asked if he had touched her car during that encounter. Thorne said yes. He had opened the driver's side door to check if the interior light was draining the battery, a common cause of dead batteries. Thorne asked if Thorne had seen Iris again after that night. Thorne said no. Thorne asked if Thorne had been involved in her death. Thorne said no, absolutely not. Thorne asked why he hadn't come forward when the murder was reported in the news. Thorne said he hadn't realized it was the same person. He had known her only as Iris, hadn't known her last name, and hadn't connected the news reports to the woman he'd helped in the parking lot until much later. Thorne asked if he had been in the rail yard the night of the murder. Thorne said he couldn't remember. It was more than 2 decades ago, and he had been using drugs heavily at the time, which affected his memory. Thorne sat down. Ridge's cross-examination was methodical and pointed. He established that Thorne had not disclosed this encounter to police during the original investigation, that he had been arrested multiple times in the years since, and had never mentioned knowing Iris or having contact with her car. Ridge asked why the jury should believe Thorne's explanation now, when it was convenient to his interests and when no independent evidence corroborated the jumpstart story. Thorne said he had no reason to lie, that he was already serving time, and that he had nothing to gain by testifying. Ridge asked whether Thorne had been in the rail yard the night of the murder. Thorne repeated that he couldn't remember. Ridge asked if Thorne had driven Iris's car that night. Thorne said no. Ridge asked if Thorne's DNA might be found on the steering wheel or gear shift if those items were retested. Thorne's attorney leaned in and whispered, and Thorne invoked his Fifth Amendment right, refusing to answer. Ridge asked if Thorne had strangled Iris. Thorne's attorney objected, and Thorne again invoked the Fifth. Ridge paused, letting the silence fill the courtroom, then sat down. Judge Keystone took the matter under submission, stating that a written ruling would be issued within 30 days. The parties filed supplemental briefs in the following weeks, with Thorne arguing that Thorne's evasiveness on cross-examination did not diminish the forensic reliability of the fingerprint, and that the print's presence on the car was inconsistent with the prosecution's theory at trial. Ridge argued that Thorne's testimony was self-serving and that the fingerprint, while intriguing, did not meet the standard for vacating a conviction, which required proof that no reasonable jury would have convicted in light of the new evidence. The ruling arrived 4 weeks later, a 16-page written opinion meticulously analyzing the evidence, the legal standards, and the credibility assessments. Judge Keystone began by summarizing the procedural history and the statutory framework under the amended post-conviction relief law. The court found that the fingerprint evidence qualified as newly discovered evidence within the meaning of the statute, that it was material and exculpatory, and that it could not have been obtained at trial through reasonable diligence because the AFIS match required database technology and algorithmic capabilities that were unavailable or undeveloped at the time of Rook's conviction. The court noted that Thorne's testimony was evasive and self-serving, that his invocation of the Fifth Amendment on key questions raised credibility concerns, and that his explanation for the fingerprint, the jump start in a parking lot weeks before the murder, was uncorroborated and convenient. Nevertheless, the court found that the fingerprint's forensic reliability, as established by Juniper's expert testimony, outweighed credibility concerns about Thorne's self-interest. The opinion concluded that the fingerprint evidence was significant because it contradicted a core element of the prosecution's case at trial: the theory that Rook had been the sole individual with access to the victim's car and that no other plausible suspect existed. The court found that, had the jury heard evidence that another individual with a criminal history and geographic proximity to the crime scene had left a fingerprint on the car's door handle, there was a reasonable probability, sufficient to undermine confidence in the verdict, that at least one juror would have harbored reasonable doubt about Rook's guilt. The court noted that the prosecution's case had rested heavily on Moss's eyewitness identification and the cell tower ping, both of which were circumstantial and contested, and that the fingerprint would have provided the defense with a concrete alternative suspect theory. The conviction was vacated. The charges were dismissed without prejudice, meaning the state retained the legal authority to refile and pursue a retrial. But Ridge announced in a press statement issued that afternoon that the district attorney's office would not seek a retrial given the passage of time, the degradation of witness memory and physical evidence, and the emergence of evidence pointing to another suspect. Rook was released from custody the following afternoon. The processing took hours. Paperwork to formally discharge him from the Department of Corrections database, retrieval of personal effects that had been stored since his arrest and transfer 22 years earlier, a medical clearance confirming he had no outstanding health issues requiring follow-up, and a meeting with a re-entry coordinator who handed him a folder containing bus vouchers, a list of social services, information about compensation for wrongful conviction, and a pamphlet on navigating life after incarceration. He walked out through the main gate of the county jail at dusk, the sky streaked with orange and purple, carrying a clear plastic bag with his belongings, a few letters, a legal pad, a photograph of his daughter. Wren was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her car. They stood facing each other for a moment, neither quite sure how to bridge the gap, the distance, the years, then embraced without speaking, holding on as the light faded. The weeks that followed were disorienting in ways Rook had not anticipated. He stayed with Wren in her two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, sleeping on a couch that felt too soft after decades of prison mattresses, waking at odd hours because the silence, the absence of cell doors clanging, guards shouting, the constant hum of institutional life was unfamiliar and unsettling. He applied for compensation under the state's wrongful conviction statute, which provided a fixed sum of $50,000 per year of incarceration. But the process required extensive documentation, affidavits, court orders, tax forms, and could take months or even years to resolve with no guarantee of approval. He met with an attorney specializing in expungement and record clearing to begin the process of removing his arrest and conviction from public databases, a process that involved filing petitions in multiple jurisdictions, appearing at hearings to demonstrate that he had been exonerated rather than merely released, and navigating bureaucratic systems that moved slowly and often required repeated follow-up. The label exonerated carried less practical weight than Rook had imagined. Background checks still flagged his arrest, and employers hesitated when they saw the gap in his work history, 22 years unaccounted for, a period that required explanation and that often triggered suspicion, even when he explained the wrongful conviction. He applied for jobs in security, warehousing, and retail, fields where his age and lack of recent experience were less disqualifying. But the responses were scarce, and the interviews, when they occurred, were awkward. He felt the weight of lost time in every interaction. Technology had changed, cultural references had shifted, and the rhythms of daily life in the free world required adjustments he hadn't anticipated. The case prompted internal reviews within the Granite County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office. The sheriff commissioned an audit of fingerprint protocols and evidence handling, which revealed that dozens of cases from the early 2000s had latent prints catalogued, but never run through AFIS after the system was upgraded and expanded in subsequent years. The audit recommended retroactive searches for all unidentified prints in unsolved cases and a policy requiring automatic AFIS queries for all major felonies. Aber, long retired and living in a neighboring state, gave a brief statement to a reporter from the local newspaper, saying he had followed procedure, had worked the case diligently, and stood by the integrity of his investigation given the tools and information available at the time. Moss, tracked down by the same reporter, declined to comment beyond a written statement, saying he had testified truthfully to the best of his recollection, and that he regretted any role his testimony may have played in a wrongful conviction. Thorne was not charged in connection with Iris's murder. The fingerprint alone, while significant, was insufficient for prosecution. It placed him in contact with the car, but did not prove he had committed the murder, and the other physical evidence from the crime scene did not link him definitively to the killing. The district attorney's office reviewed the case file and consulted with forensic experts, but concluded that, without additional evidence, a prosecution would not meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. Thorne completed his probation violation sentence and was released. His whereabouts were not publicly disclosed. Rook's daughter, now in her 20s and living out of state, reached out through Wren a few weeks after Rook's release. They spoke by phone, awkwardly at first, navigating the strangeness of a relationship that had been frozen in time and then abruptly unfrozen. She asked questions Rook didn't know how to answer: how he had survived, whether he was angry, what he planned to do, whether he blamed her for not visiting more often. He told her he didn't blame her, that he understood how hard it had been, that he was still figuring out who he was outside of the system that had defined him for so long. She said she wanted to visit, to spend time together, to try to rebuild what had been lost. He said he would like that very much. The story of Rook's exoneration became a case study in forensic science courses and wrongful conviction clinics across the country. Thorne's clinic published a detailed report analyzing the factors that had contributed to the wrongful conviction: over-reliance on a single eyewitness identification made under poor conditions, inadequate forensic follow-up on exculpatory evidence, the absence of recorded interrogations that would have provided an objective record of what was said, and the confirmation bias that set in after Moss's identification focused the investigation narrowly on Rook to the exclusion of other leads. The report recommended a series of reforms: mandatory recording of all custodial interrogations, blind administration of photo arrays and lineups to prevent administrator bias, automatic AFIS searches for all latent prints recovered in major felonies, expanded access to post-conviction forensic testing, and training for judges and prosecutors on the limitations of eyewitness testimony and the importance of pursuing exculpatory leads. Some of the recommendations were adopted by the state legislature in a package of criminal justice reforms passed 2 years later. Others remained aspirational, pending funding, political will, and the slow process of institutional change. Rook's case also highlighted the fragility of forensic evidence and the importance of preserving physical evidence for future re-examination. The fingerprint had existed from the beginning, photographed and preserved on an acetate card, catalogued and stored in an evidence locker. Yet it had taken 2 decades, a change in statutory law, the advent of advanced database technology, and the efforts of a volunteer legal clinic to unlock its meaning. That delay was not the result of conspiracy or corruption, but of technological and legal limitations that made certain truths inaccessible until systems evolved and advocates fought to access them. The lesson was both hopeful and sobering. Evidence could vindicate, but only if someone fought to access it, if laws allowed re-examination, if records were preserved despite budget constraints and storage challenges, and if institutions remained accountable and willing to revisit their conclusions. On a quiet morning 6 months after his release, Rook sat at Wren's kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the light shift through the window as the sun rose over the city. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. He thought about the years he had lost, birthdays, holidays, ordinary days that no one remembers, but that accumulate into a life. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the jurors who had convicted him, the appellate judges who had affirmed the verdict, the parole boards that had denied him release. He thought about Iris, whose death had set all of this in motion, and about the family she had left behind, Lark and the others, whose grief had been compounded by the knowledge that justice had been misdirected for so long that the person responsible might never be held accountable. He thought about Thorne, who had walked free while Rook served time, and about the randomness of the fingerprint on a door handle, how a single touch, preserved by chance, had eventually told the truth. He thought about the system that had called him guilty for 22 years and the fingerprint that had proven otherwise. The reversal did not erase the time or restore what was lost. The birthdays, the graduations, the quiet evenings, the chance to raise his daughter, the years with his mother before she died. But it had given him something he had almost stopped believing in. The validation that he had been right to insist on his innocence, the knowledge that the evidence had always been there, waiting for someone to look again, and the possibility of a future no longer defined by someone else's mistake. Wren came into the kitchen, poured herself coffee and sat across from him. They didn't speak at first, just sat together in the morning light. After a while she asked what he was thinking about. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He said he was thinking about second chances, about how rare they were and how fragile, about how many people never got them because the evidence was lost or destroyed, because no one fought for them, because the law didn't allow re-examination, or because time simply ran out. He said he was thinking about Iris and about how her family deserved better than a conviction that turned out to be wrong, how they deserved real answers and real justice. He said he was thinking about moving forward, even though he wasn't sure yet what that looked like. Wren reached across the table and took his hand. She said they would figure it out together, one day at a time. He nodded. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars on the highway, birds in the trees, the hum of ordinary life continuing as it always did. For the first time in 22 years, Rook was part of that life again, no longer behind walls or glass, no longer counting days on a calendar that stretched endlessly forward. The truth had been buried for more than 2 decades, hidden in an evidence envelope, waiting for technology to advance and for someone to demand that it be examined. And when it was, the truth had spoken clearly. The wrong man had been behind bars, and a single fingerprint had cracked the case wide open and set him free.